Hello everyone and welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick and this is a show about Canadian culture and the way it informs this nation's history. On this episode, we're going to be taking a more political approach. Since the show has started, I have been alluding multiple times to the way the government acts, or how people have reacted to it in Canada and various points in its history. I've done so without necessarily explaining what those political institutions fundamentally look like, and how they realistically act, which can admittedly be confusing to those who are not entrenched in the country's history or daily life. I want to change that today on this episode. You see, politics and its history are a part of a nation's culture, whether we agree with the representatives of that government or not. While history and nationhood is most importantly dictated by the so-called common people, we cannot ignore that figures in leadership roles, whatever form that may take, are in some sense a reflection of the times and how a society was hoped to be constructed. I also felt that it was important to cover a history and an overview of what the government in northern North America is at our point in the chronology, because pretty soon there are going to be a series of changes that will lead to increasingly rapid shifts in the way government is conducted in the future Canada. So, it is better to understand the context of where our political institutions come from in this country and where they are in the 1820s and 30s before talking about where they are going. Right? Seems logical. Obviously, for the sake of time, and in the interest of keeping this show captivating, I cannot cover every aspect of the government between New France and early 19th century British North America. What I will be mostly focusing on are the general ideas of what the significant aspects of the government are, why they are important, and especially concentrate on the ways in which they shifted and translated from one empire to the next, or even from one generation to the next. I won't be covering a specific book like I usually do on the show, as a way to parallel the history. Mostly because we are going to be covering many periods of time in Canadian history, and finding cultural items or such that cover every single one of them is tedious, and would make the show like 2 hours long, which I don't think anyone wants. I admit, this is an episode that is going to be more like a straightforward historical outlook. Something that I try to avoid, but I really think that it's necessary before we move forward. Before we begin, a quick reminder that if you want to support the show and help it, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or checking out the recommended reading list in the description. It's filled with books that are related to the topics we've been covering, and if you buy them through the links I set up, it gives me a kickback at no extra cost to you. Alright, let's get cracking. Kicking things off, let's look back at New France. Some of you might be thinking already, shit, again? Well, yeah, again. New France left an indelible mark on Canadian history and its political field, so we have to talk about it here. The impact of that time is mostly remembered or perceived as being the francophone element in Canada, but it goes deeper than that. Even in politics. We won't be talking here about the history of how New France came to be, because we've already covered that, but of what the structure looked like once it was more or less firmly established. New France was the name of the territory, but as an administrative body, it was known as the Royal Colony of New France, and we'll see why in a minute. I want to cover how that was managed for the roughly 200 years of the existence of New France. But first, I want to start by talking about another system that extended from the administrative one, which is known as the seigneurial system, which had an impact on Canadian, and later specifically French-Canadian, social and geographic relations. We've talked a few times on the show about how the British government would create and provide royal charters to private companies, or individuals that would create nominal companies to exploit and develop the land in North America to a satisfactorily European way. The French government, which I will remind you was an absolute monarchy until the late 18th century, did much the same thing. French monarchs, especially after Samuel de Champlain and his soldiers had explored a big chunk of the land and set up a few forts, would effectively pass over control of the administration of the colony to private companies. One of the most well-known of these was known as the Compagnie des 100 Associés, which translates to the Company of the 100 Associates. These companies would basically be responsible for bringing settlers, which were most often soldiers and men, which became a problem for a while, to the territory, and ensuring the peace. The Compagnie des 100 Associés was also responsible for the distribution of land under the aforementioned seigneurial tenure, which basically meant that, exactly like it was seen in places in France, plots of land were handed out to lords, or as they're known in French, des seigneurs, who would individually manage it, and the settlers that worked on it. Professor Emeritus Jacques Mathieu from the University of Laval talks of the seigneurial system like this, quote, "Although inspired by the feudal system, in New France, the seigneurial system had more to do with the distribution and occupation of space, and the authorities in France even wanted to make it a way of peopling the colony. The system was controlled by a body of laws and rules outlining rights and obligations on both sides. The state granted large portions of land to individuals, who became seigneurs, and in turn were supposed to allocate the lands among commoners, by providing grants to those habitants, or inhabitants, who requested them, although usually not before reserving vast sections of lands for themselves. The seigneur was supposed to render fealty and homage to the king's representative as a symbol of the vassal's subjection to the lord, from whom he held his fief." End quote. That was long. So, essentially, each land grant established its own small community within the larger New France body. This is important to note, because many of the ways in which the land was organized by the French would continue into the present, with geographical outlines of the territory still being visible to this day. And as we'll see, just because there was a lord on each land that himself was overseen by, as we just established, the representative of the king, the governor, that doesn't mean that there was that much control in New France. And we'll get to that. This type of system, though, only lasted until about 1663, with the last 100 years of the French colony being effectively placed under direct monarchical rule under Louis XIV, the granddaddy and epitome of absolutism in France. He basically wanted a more direct impact on everything that France touched, and that meant the colonies as well. The seigneurial system itself would not change. Land would still be distributed and managed in the way I just mentioned. The difference is that it would not be up to a private company to decide who got the land. It became the intendant's or governor's choice. Who are the intendant and governor, I hear you ask in a slightly confused tone? Well, in a flawless segue, let's discuss in more detail what the government in New France looked like for the greater part of its history. This is where New France would stabilize into the governmental system that would pretty much remain until the British conquest. Contrary to what was going on in France before the Revolution, where most officials could buy their way into office, the officials in New France were appointed by the king directly. This made for a system that was surprisingly more accountable to mistakes and authority than in the mother country. The king could hire and fire anyone in the colonies where it wasn't possible in his own country. The two significant positions in New France were the governor and the intendant. The governor being the official, as I just said, representative of the king in New France. There were more than two public figures in that system. But outside from the ones I'm talking about here, it mostly becomes lower-level lieutenants who enact what their superiors decide on a smaller scale. Oh, and religious figures. But really, they permeated every aspect of society, and we've talked about them before. They're ubiquitous, and I feel it's more interesting to talk about the governors and intendants. The church was important and everywhere, don't get me wrong. But they ultimately were there, at least in New France, to be the quote-unquote moral fiber of a people who were already principally Catholic, and who were actively working to convert those who weren't, i.e. the natives, or no, just the natives. The governor was in charge of the grand scheme of things. He represented the king in the colony, as well as being in charge of the military and diplomatic affairs. Whatever involved New France as an overall entity was basically the governor's territory. The only people that the governor reported to directly was the king, who he represented, and the Ministère de la Marine, which is the Minister of the Marine. That is basically a department in France that dealt with the colonies in Canada. Notable governors included, obviously, Samuel de Champlain, who is often recognized as being the first one, and the Comte de Frontenac, who stayed on for quite a while in the later 17th century, and who was actually recalled because of problems he had with his intendant, becoming essentially an example of the accountability that these governors and intendants had towards the higher-ups. The intendant, again, flawless segue, took care of the more internal matters. The first, and arguably most well-known intendant of New France, was Jean Talon, who took up office in 1665. This figure took care of financial and judicial issues, both in the broadest sense possible. Policing, the provision of justice, taxes, all of that super fun stuff, all of that fell under his supervision. Now, you might be thinking that this seems like a pretty authoritarian system. Two men, and it always was men, by the way, that controlled most of the area for the king? Sounds pretty autocratic. And to an extent, it was. But, as I mentioned earlier, it was actually better to some degree than in France. Does that excuse that kind of government and make it ostensibly better? No, not really. But it does contextualize it. These were more accountable systems, but they were also freer ones in some ways. Given the lack of extremely bureaucratic and highly structured administrative oversight like in France, or at least direct oversight, it was difficult for public figures, from the government, the church, or otherwise, to fully and autocratically administer the small population that was spread out over a large territory. Remember, we're talking here essentially about the south of Quebec and the south of Ontario, or at least the southeast part of Ontario, that was populated by a couple thousand people, right? That's not a great population density. And so it becomes hard to control all of that or to really gather them all under one law. What you also see happening is a loosening of some of those laws or practices in New France that had become unsustainable in France, and were one of the reasons why that revolution happened over there in the first place. The tithe, for example, which was the amount of grain or produce owed to the Lord every year, was placed at 1/26th of the settler's annual production, which was much, much lower than in France. So, what do we learn from New France's system? Well, as mentioned before, what mostly remained was the seigneurial system, which came increasingly into the hands of aristocrats or religious figures. Many of these communities were placed along the St. Lawrence River and its tributaries, where populations would grow and develop for a long time. Makes sense, of course. You're not going to go further up north where you have less access to one of the main bodies of water of Canada. But from a political and social standpoint, something else occurred that would follow the French Canadians for a very long time. They were ostensibly left alone, or rather, more than they were in France. The system of governors and such is something that we will see come back again and again in Canada. But one with relatively little oversight, as in New France, would be hard to come by again. Obviously, the soldiers had duties towards their lords, and the governor and all that in times of war, and they needed to produce certain amounts, but it was far from being the extent that you saw in the so-called Old World. As time goes by, the increase in eventual British control is something that will haunt the Canadiens and their memory of not being told what to do as much, or how to do it. Allow me to jump ahead. Remember, this is an overview of the major points of government, not an in-depth analysis. Where do we go from a system of lords with a relatively low level of oversight by a government whose main goal was to maintain a military and almost exclusively Catholic colony and outpost? Well, you go to the province of Quebec, which is what New France became known as under the British. We've talked about this one a few times, and I want to focus more on a particular element on top of the initial government that the British set up in the 18th century, and that is the integration of French laws into the British system. Our initial reaction, or assumption, when thinking about the transition of a territory or population from one empire to the next, is that everything shifted. It would be easy and logical for many to assume that when the British took over from the French, they scrapped everything their predecessors had built and moved on from there without taking the local Canadian population that now had its own rules and customs into consideration. But that's not quite how it went down. Close, but not quite. First, I want to clarify the general sense of government in British North America. A major difference is that the British did not function in a seigneurial system. They colonized by allowing for land grants and settlement, yes, but not every plot of allocated land had its de facto lord. It was much more of a private thing. People could buy land, or were given it because of service to the crown. And it wasn't necessarily a lord or an aristocrat that had to get it. It was a much more individualistic and a bit more capitalistic way to look at it, instead of a feudal way as Professor Mathieu had pointed out, which the French system was closest to. This is going to come up again later. Not unlike the French, the British installed a series of governors in their colonies, including in Canada. This would first be applied in the future country in Nova Scotia from the early 18th century onward. These men, again, there was no room for women in this position, would most often be lords or military officers and would accomplish the same basic functions, and that is, represent the British Crown and laws in the colonies. The names of these public offices were slightly different from the French, though, with the highest authority in the colony being the governor or governor general, and his subordinates being known as the lieutenant governors rather than the intendants. Professor Colin Reid points out that, quote, in both the French and English regimes, the governors general exercised at best a shadowy authority over their supposed inferiors, end quote. I'm bringing this up again because while the governors and administrators would have a tenuous authoritative relationship, it doesn't mean that for many in the population, there was no oversight. This isn't New France anymore, and the British wanted the Canadiens to know that. Add to that the fact that there was a bigger population to control as immigrants arrived from what would become the United States pretty soon, and more immigrants arrived from Great Britain, made it that there was a greater ease to control a population, right? Because you can actually catalog them more easily. In the Royal Proclamation of 1763, that's right, we're going back to this, and there was more added to it than just ceding French territory over to the British and carving out native territory to the west. The British administration also included their plans for integrating, or rather, assimilating, the Canadiens, which I'll remind listeners is the term given to the people here for a while because they were seen as being almost exclusively French-speaking, into the new English-based system. This was hopefully a system that would function like in the 13 colonies. Remember, this is pre-American Revolution, so they could still pretend that it kind of worked. Indeed, for about the first few years of the British rule in the province of Quebec, under the governorship of James Murray, the intent was to assimilate and anglicize the French-speaking population and society. This was mostly done because of the demands of British merchants, who wanted to be better represented and protected by the laws they knew, and out of a perception that it would bring about a more peaceful society if all were assimilated into the same structure. Very rapidly, though, these attempts failed, only succeeding in angering the newly conquered Canadians, whose Catholic and Francophone reality was contradictory to the British and hard to remove. There were attempts to reconcile merchant demands and Canadian property rights and identity rights, but it was too little too late. This is where Murray was removed from the position of governor, and a new man by the name of Guy Carleton, the first Baron Dorchester, was brought in. I can't go over every reform that Carleton had been present for, because there were a lot to be sure. The main point that I want to make is that soon after his appointment to the role of governor of the province of Quebec, he would succeed where Murray had failed. By 1774, seeing that there were troubles brewing in the 13 colonies, and needing to avoid them in the province for the sake of his position and his cherished empire in general, he would officially implement the Quebec Act. This act expanded the province's breadth and officially marked the end of Britain's assimilation policy for the French Canadians. The authority would still be the imperial one in structure, and the Canadians would still need to pledge loyalty to it. But the seigneurial system would be maintained on a lower level, and the Canadians would still be allowed to speak French and practice their Catholic religion. Furthermore, the French Canadians would be allowed to participate in councils, and civil laws, which concerned the more daily and local affairs, would be inspired by the French tradition. The criminal code would nevertheless be British in nature. So this was absolutely huge. While it would not solve every problem between the French and English, it would certainly quote-unquote pacify a population to an extent that would help the British in North America. This would become particularly interesting in the American Revolution, as it broke out and the Americans invaded Canada. While the Canadians did not actively join the British or do so in droves against the American rebels, most of them would have been volunteers at the time anyway, and not part of the British Army proper, they did not actively fight against them either. This is in part due to the concessions that appeased many in Canada, and also that the Catholic Church, because of the rights given to them by the British, were proponents of not fighting against them. These two factors combined so as to make the Canadians more willing to take their chances with the British than the Americans, who were already seen as being a bit more assimilationist, perhaps due to their more overt treatment of the natives, or perhaps because of British propaganda, or maybe because of both. With the Canadian population on its way to becoming much more stable, and with it extending to the west, one of the last things that Carleton would help with in British North America is the restructuring of the entire layout of the colonies and its government with the 1791 Constitutional Act, which is one of the last places we will be stopping for this episode. So, the arrival of the Loyalists, don't worry, I'm not going to be talking about them again this week, would shift the balance linguistically, culturally, and politically in British North America. Many went to Nova Scotia initially, but many also went up to the western part of the province of Quebec, either directly from the United States or by moving westward from the Atlantic. This would accentuate the east-west French-English divides that were starting to develop in that province. In 1791, the Constitutional Act would work to solve these divisions and avoid causing tensions within the same province. This is where we see the formation of Upper and Lower Canada, referencing where they are exactly on the St. Lawrence. Now, British North America was made up of those two provinces, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. All of these places being near a main water source or the ocean. Upper and Lower Canada did not yet extend northward as those provinces do now. Alright, so what does this serve to the narrative of the show? If it was just a shift in geography, relatively little. It's an easier way for the British to administer, I guess. But let's think about this for a minute. Upper Canada is much more English-speaking, Lower Canada, French. The differences in laws are going to have to be addressed. Essentially, Lower Canada would get to keep those concessions that were made earlier that allowed their French Catholic population to continue to live as they will within the British system. In Upper Canada, though, there was little point to that. Nothing stopped the French Canadians from going there, but concessions to them were not a priority. Upper Canada would more readily adopt British-style laws across the board. This would cause some issues, especially down the line after Confederation, and we will get to that in a future episode, when the place of Catholic schools or the place of the French language would come into question as a prominent part of Canada. What accommodations should be made in other provinces where there is a minority Francophone or Catholic population? But that question is not for today. Lower and Upper Canada would find themselves further divided in 1791 in some respects, and given the same legal status in others. The most notable similarity is that both Canadas got a legislative assembly, which had the power to vote on laws in their province, something that Nova Scotia actually received way back in 1758. This will be a recurring topic, in fact. Nova Scotia was often one of those places in Canada that would get such democratic advances long before the others, or at least somewhat before the others. It was seen as a more stable place than the more multicultural and incendiary Canadas. It was a place where such changes could be more easily adopted and were seen as more deserved. Although those advances in Nova Scotia would also come under fire by conservative MPs, but we'll get to that on a later episode. Actually, probably on the next episode. Bit of a sizzle reel right there. Regardless, in both Nova Scotia and the Canadas, despite the advance that an elected legislative assembly represents, this was a limited form of democracy. Not only were the electors a small group, that is, property-owning adult males, but also the legislative assembly was subjected to the oversight of an upper house, known as the Executive Council, which itself was under the governor. These latter two parts of the government were not elected, but were chosen with their power over the legislative assembly being quite strong, and with the possibility of being limited only by the colonial administration, which chose them in the first place. Now, the Legislative Assembly could, and did vote in laws that mainly concerned local or regional matters, but things that attempted to kickstart more progressive or democratic governmental changes were often vetoed. They were not completely ineffectual, but let's just say that it took some time for things to change, even in that goody two-shoes Nova Scotia over there. Very quickly, as the 1800s rolled around, discontent concerning these institutions would make themselves more and more evident, as anger towards the aristocratic executive branches, mostly made up of rich, conservative British ministers, would rise. This is who we were talking about a few episodes ago with the Family Compact, or the Chateau Clique as it was known in Lower Canada. Right? These kind of nebulous aristocratic group that kept coming up again and again in positions of higher power in Canadian society, and that made the Legislative Assembly feel useless or ineffective. These tensions would appear in both Lower and Upper Canada, but would be more distinct in Lower Canada, or more recognizable at least, because of the difference in French Canadian and British places in society. Just because of the language barrier, for example, although it was deeper than that, you could see greater distinction between the Executive Council, which was much more English-speaking, and the Legislative Assembly, which was much more French-speaking. It was a clear indication for many French Canadians where they stood in society. But again, in Upper Canada, it was quite the issue as well. One final thing that I want to mention is a difference. One that will have us come full circle from the start of the episode. Property laws and regulations were established as clearly different in the new Canadas, with each one maintaining the differences that their respective traditions upheld. In Upper Canada, property was held freely by individuals, whereas in Lower Canada, they still kept the same seigneurial system. That's right, they were still functioning more or less on the New France model, and having a lord run the joint over a few lands. It probably lasted longer than you think too, until 1854. That's about 200 years of living under that system. It would, at that moment, be voted out of existence, but it would nevertheless leave a mark on Quebec, and not only from a geographic standpoint. As Professor Jacques Mathieu once again notes, quote, "The system also survived in the collective memory as a historic symbol of the traditional mode of settlement and as an institution that promoted the survival of the nation." End quote. Right, even if it wasn't the better system, the French Canadians still held on to it as a sign of their identity, as something that they could hold on to that was different from their British overlords. Alright, so through all the divides and differences and changes in empire that Canada has gone through from the 17th century up until our point in the 1830s, in the show's chronology, is there a continuity to be seen? Well, yeah. It's important to remember that changes are slow to be made in these periods, and Canada is a place that has been especially noted for its more conservative development, notably when compared to its American neighbor. This was a part of my intent here, actually, to show how similar things were and how easy it was for governments and administrators to fall back on old ways of doing things. The governors and lieutenant governors, the French settlement laws and traditions that survived for centuries, these were all ways that were meant to either establish a very stable and highly structured society, or through which to feel safe in times of great change, like those brought on by changing empires. This safety can be from both ends as well. The British wanting to maintain a relatively happy population, at least on paper, and the French Canadians wanting to maintain a distinct identity. I think the greatest point that I'm laboring to make is just how close to imperialism Canada remains throughout all this time. While it is most certainly developing an identity on its own, French and English alike, you see the close imperial ties and governing systems remain from Nova Scotia to Upper Canada, well into the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm talking about this now because soon in our history, those ties and systems are going to be put into question with a series of rebellions that were meant to be preemptively stopped through these various government and political changes. The rebellions of 1837 are coming to British North America, and with it is a promise of a more democratic future, one that hopes to shake the foundations of imperialism in Canada. Okay, that is it for this episode. Thank you everyone for listening. You can reach out with any questions, comments, or concerns on the Facebook page, through Twitter, and by email. All links are in the description. You can support the show through Ko-fi or PayPal donations, and through affiliate links in the recommended reading page I set up. Once again, you can find all that in the description. Hopefully soon I'll get around to some perks like extra episodes that you can maybe get through Patreon that'll kind of incite people to help boost the show or help contribute to the show. For now, it'll be donation-based. Finally, if you could leave a review on iTunes, it would be very appreciated. It really does help to boost the show and get it to more people's ears. For now, I'll just wish you all excellent health and that I hope you and your loved ones can stay safe in these intense times. I'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.